The whole town came to her funeral. But when they started digging the grave, snakes crawled out of the ground. What they found out later silenced even those closest to her. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. In the languid stillness of a southern summer, where the heat clung to the skin like a damp veil and cicadas hummed in the background like a chorus that never ceased, the town of Ashford lay folded in upon itself. Nestled between rolling hills and pine forests, it was the kind of place where people still waved at one another from porches, where children played barefoot in sprinklers, and where news traveled faster than radio waves. It was a town proud of its traditions, proud of its clean streets, and prouder still of the people who gave it its character. And, of all those people, no name was held with such reverence and affection as that of Ellen Reeves. Ellen was not born in Ashford, but by the time she was 25, it felt as if she had always belonged. She had moved there after graduating summa cum laude, with a degree in early childhood education, and within a few months of arriving, she'd been offered a position at the town's only elementary school. A decade later, she was still there, teaching second grade in a classroom filled with paper flowers and drawings of smiling suns. Parents described her as the teacher you pray your child gets. She had a calm voice, a steady hand, and a way of making each child feel like they mattered. When she walked through the grocery store, children ran up to hug her waist, and their mothers mouthed thank you behind their backs. But Ellen's influence didn't stop at the schoolhouse doors. She organized weekend reading circles at the public library, ran coat drives in the winter, and led bake sales whose proceeds went to families who couldn't pay their utility bills. She visited nursing homes with her class each Christmas and made sure each elderly resident received a handmade card and a box of cookies. When a flood hit the southern end of town 3 years ago, Ellen was the one who arranged emergency housing in the school gymnasium. She cooked, cleaned, and held crying babies while their parents registered with FEMA. So when the town woke up one Friday morning to the news that Ellen Reeves had passed away in the night, it felt as if a candle had gone out. The newspaper ran a full-page tribute with a banner headline, "Ashford's Light Has Dimmed." The mayor issued a statement calling her a woman of compassion and conviction. The school's flag was lowered to half-mast, and the children were allowed to draw pictures and write goodbye letters to be buried with her. Flowers appeared on the steps of her classroom, and one little boy, eyes red-rimmed, whispered to his mother, "Who will love us now?" Her death had not been unexpected, not exactly. A few months prior, word had gotten out that she had been diagnosed with cancer. Pancreatic, someone said, though no one could confirm it. She had stopped coming to school after Christmas break, and rumors floated gently through the air like pollen. But no one saw her in town, and no one seemed to know if she was getting treatment. Those who called said she was resting. Those who wrote received no reply. Still, when the news finally broke that she had died in her sleep, it struck with the force of something sudden and brutal. She was 34. In the days that followed, Ashford prepared itself to say goodbye. The church, down on Main Street, which seated nearly 200, quickly became too small for the number of people who wished to attend the funeral. The mayor's office offered to coordinate the service at the community center, and volunteers arrived to set up chairs, arrange flower displays, and string up white banners. Former students mailed in cards and drawings from out of state. The school PTA funded a marble plaque in her honor to be affixed to the school wall. Someone arranged for a brass quartet to play at the burial. Ellen's death had become an event of public mourning. It felt less like the loss of a person and more like the loss of something elemental, like the wind changing direction or the sky deciding never to rain again. Yet, not everyone shared in the neat, packaged version of grief that settled over the town. Just 3 houses down from where Ellen had lived, a modest white bungalow with blue shutters and a porch swing that rarely moved, an old man named Harold Stern sat in his recliner, chewing the inside of his cheek. At 82, Harold was the kind of man who had learned to keep his thoughts to himself. A Navy veteran and former long-haul trucker, he had watched generations of Ashford's families grow up and pass on. But in his gut, Harold felt unease. Something about the way people talked about Ellen didn't sit right with him. It wasn't that he thought she was a bad person. No, she'd been polite to him, sure enough, but Harold had lived next to her house for over 10 years. And in that time, he had heard things that didn't line up with the angelic portrait being painted. Of course, Harold said nothing. What could he say, really? That sometimes, late at night, he'd heard shouting through the walls. That once, in the dead of winter, he'd seen an old woman, Ellen's mother, presumably, sitting on the back porch in nothing but a housecoat, shivering and clutching a blanket. He had mentioned it once, offhandedly, to the mailman, but the young man had shrugged and said, "Miss Reeves is one of the good ones." And maybe she was. Maybe Harold was losing his mind. His own daughter, who lived in Baton Rouge, had gently suggested as much the last time she visited. Still, when he heard the preparations for the funeral and the accolades and the speeches being planned, something clenched in Harold's chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that people were mourning a story, not a person. That somewhere in all the talk of goodness and light, something had been left out. Meanwhile, across town, the preparations continued. Ellen's body had been entrusted to the local funeral home, a modest place run by a husband and wife team who had known her personally. Her casket, white with silver accents, was chosen by a committee of former PTA members who had taken it upon themselves to ensure the service reflected her legacy. A memory table was arranged. Photographs of Ellen at school plays, holding up art projects with beaming children. Ellen at the library's summer reading kickoff. Ellen with her arm around the mayor at the town's centennial celebration. On the morning of the funeral, a crowd began to gather before sunrise. Women in sun hats clutched tissues. Men in short-sleeve button-ups stood with hands folded solemnly. Children, some too young to fully understand, clung to their parents' sides, confused by the sudden formality. The ceremony was moving, even beautiful. People spoke of her tirelessness, her humility, her laughter. The brass quartet played Amazing Grace, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The burial was scheduled to follow immediately after the service. A procession of cars, headlights on, wound slowly up the hill to the town cemetery. The cemetery itself was small and set on the edge of the woods, flanked by whispering trees and the faint hum of crickets. A gentle breeze stirred the long grass. The grave had not yet been dug. It was tradition in Ashford for the final steps of burial to happen as the mourners waited, a symbolic gesture to show the community returning one of their own to the earth. 2 workers from the cemetery maintenance crew stood ready, shovels in hand. One of them, Miguel Sanchez, was relatively new to the job. The other, a wiry man named Roy, had been digging graves for over 20 years. As they began to dig, the mood remained somber. The crowd stood in silence, the white casket gleaming in the midday sun. But almost immediately, Roy muttered something under his breath and wiped his forehead. "Ground's dry as bone," he whispered to Miguel. "Shouldn't be this way. We had rain last week." Miguel nodded, pressing his foot harder on the shovel, but the soil resisted. It crumbled at the top, but hardened beneath like baked clay. Roy switched to a pickaxe, grunting with each swing. Minutes passed. Sweat gathered at their temples. Then Miguel froze. "What was that?" he said. From a fissure in the soil, something shifted. A slither. Then another. Roy took a step back. Miguel leaned forward and saw a flicker of movement. A tongue, black and forked. And then, unmistakably, a snake. Not large, but quick. Then another. And another. Miguel stumbled back as one of them reared up and hissed. "Jesus," Roy said, stepping away. The crowd hadn't noticed yet, but the snakes kept coming. Half a dozen, maybe more, slithering out from beneath the dry crust of the earth. Miguel called out, and someone screamed. Then another scream. People began to back away, clutching purses, grabbing children. One of the snakes darted toward a man's foot and struck. The man collapsed, screaming in pain, as a paramedic rushed forward. In a matter of minutes, the burial had devolved into chaos. The mourners fled toward their cars. The casket was quickly lifted and set aside as emergency crews tried to assess the situation. The snakes were not rare in that part of the country, but they didn't behave like this. Not in such numbers. Not with such aggression. The decision was made swiftly. The burial would have to wait. As the crowd dissipated and the casket was returned to the hearse, Harold stood at a distance, unmoving. His eyes were narrowed. In all his years in Ashford, he had never seen anything like this, and in the tightness of his chest, he felt something not quite like surprise. He turned, ever so slowly, and began walking home. The heat had not lifted. It clung to the skin and settled into the marrow, oppressive and heavy, as if the sky itself was unwilling to exhale. Even as the mourning ceremony gave way to the slow procession of cars inching toward the cemetery, the sun bore down on Ashford without mercy. The hush that had enveloped the community center now stretched across the hillside where the cemetery stood, as if the whole town had entered into a collective silence too deep for words. The cemetery, modest and old, had never seen such a gathering. It was situated on the outer edge of town, where the land sloped upward into pine groves and forgotten logging trails. Normally quiet, with only the sound of wind brushing against gravestones and birds nesting in the elms, it now bristled with the presence of hundreds of townspeople. They came in their Sunday best, hands folded and expressions solemn, drifting between rows of headstones with a kind of reverent awe. Ellen Reeves, they said among themselves, would have hated the attention, but they also agreed. It was no less than she deserved. A long white tent had been erected at the burial site, under which rows of folding chairs sat empty, soon to be filled by mourners. A floral arch framed the spot where her casket would rest, and a brass stand stood ready for the plaque that bore her name and dates. Ellen Marie Reeves, 1989-2023. Teacher, advocate, friend. The town's maintenance staff had outdone themselves. Paths swept clean, hedges trimmed, even a small water station set up to keep attendees from fainting in the heat. And still, a murmur ran through the crowd, low and uncertain. Among the mourners was a man named Thomas Burrell, father to two of Ellen's former students. He held his son's hand tightly as they approached the tent, eyes scanning the sea of faces. Thomas had once said Ellen was the only adult his children truly trusted. He remembered how she'd dropped off school supplies one year when his hours were cut. No fanfare, no mention of it later. He remembered the time she stayed after school with his daughter, helping her relearn how to read after a traumatic accident. He remembered her smile, soft, patient, endless. And now he stood here with a lump in his throat, and a hollow where admiration had lived. The white hearse pulled to a slow stop. The pallbearers, all chosen by the town's funeral committee, stepped forward with practiced grace. They lifted the casket from the back and carried it down the path toward the prepared site. A hush fell over the assembly. The children who had come, many of them too young to understand the weight of what they witnessed, watched with wide eyes, clutching programs in sticky hands. An older girl whispered a prayer beneath her breath, words trembling on her lips. Miguel Sanchez adjusted the wide brim of his hat and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He was nervous, and not just because of the crowd. This was his first major burial since taking the job at Ashford Cemetery, and he wanted everything to go right. Roy, his more experienced partner, stood a few feet away, leaning on a shovel and chewing a toothpick. Miguel glanced at him for reassurance. Roy only shrugged. "Ground's tough," he muttered. "Been dry." Miguel stepped forward and sank his shovel into the dirt, or tried to. The blade barely made a dent. He pressed harder, shifting his weight. The soil refused. It was packed, brittle, stubborn in a way that struck him as unusual. They had measured and marked this spot 2 days prior. There had been no indication of a problem then. But now, something felt wrong. Roy joined him, setting his pickaxe against the hard earth. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, but his brow furrowed as the tool struck stone. Then another. Miguel looked up, concern creeping into his voice. "Was this area ever surveyed?" Roy grunted. "Long time ago. Nothing flagged." But the ground continued to resist, shovel after shovel of dust-like soil, laced with stones and clumps of old, rootless debris. The kind of soil that didn't belong in this part of town. They had worked maybe 10 minutes when Miguel paused, leaning forward. He had seen it only briefly. Something smooth, dark, moving where no movement should be. "Roy," he said quietly, "you see that?" Roy stopped. Together they watched as the soil twitched again, then parted. The first snake emerged silently, curling out of the earth like smoke. It was dark brown, its scales patterned in faint diamonds, eyes glinting. Then came a second, a third. Miguel stepped back, heart pounding. "Shit," Roy muttered, swinging his pickaxe to one side. But the snakes kept coming. Not just one or two, half a dozen, maybe more, slithering with a kind of deliberate menace from beneath the dry crust. Miguel shouted an alert, and someone screamed behind them. The crowd shifted uneasily. Another shout. Panic rippled outward. Thomas Burrow grabbed his son and pulled him away. A woman stumbled over a headstone. Another man tried to shield his daughter, tripping in the loose gravel. People fled from the burial site, shoes slipping on the dry grass. Someone called for an ambulance. One of the snakes had bitten a mourner on the ankle, and he lay convulsing near the edge of the tent, face twisted in pain. Miguel and Roy abandoned their tools. The casket had not yet been lowered, but the ground around it writhed. Roy swore loudly. He had seen snakes before. This was the South, after all, but never like this. Never in such numbers. Never so close together, as if drawn to something, as if summoned. A paramedic knelt beside the bitten man, calling for antivenom. The heat pressed down harder, making it hard to breathe. Children cried. Adults shouted instructions no one followed. In the chaos, someone knocked over the brass plaque, sending it clattering to the ground. The funeral director, pale and shaken, signaled for the casket to be returned to the hearse. There was no time, no safety, no order left. The ceremonial unity of grief had dissolved into fear. Miguel felt his hands trembling as he helped guide the casket away from the pit, away from the hissing things that twisted in the earth. In the distance, Roy cursed under his breath. "They said this ground was clean," he growled. "This ain't clean." Back near the cars, the mourners huddled together, sweat-drenched and shaken. Some speculated about old snake nests, disturbed habitats, early breeding seasons. A few whispered about omens. Most just wanted to go home. Ellen's casket was placed gently into the hearse again, and the vehicle drove off without ceremony. The procession had scattered. There would be no burial that day. In the quiet that followed, Harold Stern stood at the edge of the cemetery, unseen and untouched. He had not run. He had not spoken. His eyes had remained fixed on the pit and the way the earth had twisted, alive and angry. He had not seen snakes like that since Vietnam, and even then, not in broad daylight, not in open soil, not here. He turned and walked home, each step slow and deliberate, heart pounding, but not with fear. It was recognition, the kind of knowing that crept up from deep within, uninvited and heavy. Elsewhere, the town tried to make sense of what had happened. The mayor's office issued a statement blaming unusual heat and disrupted snake migration patterns. The funeral director scheduled a new burial time, pending weather conditions and pest control. An entomologist was called in from the state university. News crews sniffed around the edges of the story, sensing something stranger than climate. And in her apartment, above the old hardware store, a young journalist named Mia Carter stared at a blinking cursor on her laptop. She had attended the funeral out of respect. Ellen had been her second-grade teacher. She had cried during the service, but now her emotions had turned to unease. She replayed the moment the snakes emerged again and again. And she thought of something her mother had once told her. Nothing true hides forever. She began to type, slowly at first, then faster. Across town, the snakes had vanished, but the questions had only begun. The morning after the failed burial dawned with a sullen grayness that stretched across the sky like bruised silk. Though the heat had broken slightly, the air remained thick, damp, with the kind of humidity that clung to the lungs and weighed down movement. The town of Ashford, still reeling from the events of the previous day, woke slowly. Doors opened more cautiously. Conversations began in hushed tones. It was as if no one quite knew what to make of what had happened, if it had been natural, coincidental, or something more unsettling. Miguel Sanchez rose early, despite barely sleeping the night before. The image of the snakes still haunted him, how they'd emerged in that silent, organized way, how their bodies moved not in panic, but with purpose. He had grown up in the country. He knew snakes, respected them, but he'd never seen anything like that. The way the ground had almost seemed to pulse before they came, the way they had surrounded the casket, not aimlessly, but with intention. He had watched one of them curl around a wreath of lilies before vanishing into the hole it came from. The image sat behind his eyes like a brand. By 7:30 a.m., he was back at the cemetery, this time with two more workers and the foreman, a squat, no-nonsense woman named Carlene who kept her baseball cap low over her eyes and swore like she'd invented half the words herself. She walked the grounds with purpose, inspecting the original burial site like a crime scene. Miguel stood beside her, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Carlene squatted and poked at the dirt with the tip of a long screwdriver. She sniffed the air. The earth had gone still again, but there were faint traces, tiny grooves in the dust, trails where the snakes had moved. "We'll dig elsewhere," she said finally. "East Plot, near the oak grove. It's shaded and loose. Just had a burial there last week, no problems." Miguel nodded but said nothing. Something about that decision felt premature, as if they were trying to outpace something that hadn't quite revealed itself. But orders were orders. Word was sent to the mayor's office and to the funeral director. The new burial would be held that afternoon, small and private this time. No crowd, no procession, no musicians. Out of respect, they said. Out of safety, they implied. The town agreed, mostly. Some were relieved, others speculated, and a few were simply tired, eager to see the matter put to rest. By noon, a small group gathered near the second site. The oak grove provided some shade, though the ground beneath it was cracked and dry from weeks without rain. Miguel and the other workers had spent the better part of the morning digging, and though the soil was stubborn in places, it was nowhere near as difficult as the day before. No snakes, no signs of life. Just dirt, brittle and sun-baked, broken open under the weight of shovels. As the hearse approached, Miguel felt a tightness in his chest. He watched as the casket was unloaded once again, this time by a smaller team, 2 funeral home staff and Roy, who had insisted on being there. The brass plaque had been polished clean, though its corners were still nicked from yesterday's fall. A circle of chairs had been placed for the handful of family members who'd agreed to attend. Ellen's cousin, a quiet woman from out of state, sat with her hands clasped in her lap. A former colleague from the school dabbed her eyes with a tissue, though her gaze stayed fixed on the trees. The mayor, pressed and proper as always, stood at the rear, arms folded, eyes unreadable. Miguel moved to the side of the grave, shovel in hand, ready to assist. The casket was lowered slowly, ropes creaking under the weight. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, echoing through the trees. No one spoke. The priest, who'd been asked to say a few words, cleared his throat, began with a simple blessing, then faltered. He looked down, hesitated, and then closed his book. Silence returned. That's when it happened. A low tremor rippled through the ground. Not violent, not enough to make anyone stumble, but enough to be felt. The dirt around the edge of the grave shifted. Roy stepped forward, mouth open slightly. Miguel took a step back. The first snake was larger than any from the day before. It slithered from beneath the mound of soil, its scales black with faint copper rings. It hissed, rearing up just enough to be seen clearly by everyone nearby. Then another emerged, then 2 more. From the opposite side, a cluster of smaller snakes appeared, writhing and knotting together in an oily mass. The cousins screamed. People scrambled back from the grave, chairs toppling. The priest dropped his book and ran. Miguel froze, shovel still in his hands. He watched, breath held, as one of the snakes coiled itself along the rim of the casket. The coffin, still suspended by its ropes, began to tilt slightly, as if shifting of its own accord. "Get it out!" someone yelled. "Get it out of there!" Miguel moved instinctively. He grabbed the nearest rope and began pulling, arms straining. Roy joined him, hands trembling. Together they hoisted the casket out inch by inch, the snakes hissing below them, flicking their tongues at the air. When the casket reached ground level, it was yanked to safety by 2 of the funeral staff. The snakes made no move to pursue. They simply lingered at the edge of the open grave, coiling and uncoiling as if guarding something. One of them curled around a clump of disturbed earth and went still. Emergency services were called again. This time, the entire cemetery was closed off. Officials cordoned the area, citing environmental safety risks. The mayor issued another statement, far more cautious than the last, promising an investigation into the cemetery's maintenance records, soil composition, and local wildlife activity. The second burial attempt was formally canceled. That evening, Back at the funeral home, the casket was returned to storage. The director, a man named Philip Hastings, stood over it in the darkened viewing room, hand resting lightly on the smooth wood. He had worked in funeral services for nearly 30 years. He'd seen accidents, disturbances, even sabotage, but nothing like this. He stepped back slowly, as if expecting the casket to move. Elsewhere in town, the conversations grew darker. People began to whisper not just about snakes, but about meaning. Was it symbolic? Was it punishment? Was it something worse? In churches, old women clasped rosaries tighter. In bars, men speculated with nervous laughs. On front porches, neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. What had been awe the day before was now uncertainty, discomfort. Mia Carter sat in her apartment, watching the footage she had taken on her phone. She hadn't meant to film anything, it had just been a reflex. But now she played it back on a loop, the way the snakes emerged, the way they congregated, the way they ignored everything except the grave. She paused the frame, stared at the screen. Her stomach turned. It wasn't just random behavior, it was choreography. Her phone buzzed, a text from her editor at the regional paper. "You still following that Reeves story?" She stared at the message for a long moment, then typed, "Yes, and there's more going on than people realize." Across town, Harold Stern sat at his kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee beside him. The newspaper lay open, the headline blaring across the front page. "Second burial, halted due to snake infestation." He read the article, then folded it neatly and set it aside. He stared at the wall for a long time. He thought of the nights he had heard the yelling, the crying, the pleading voice that had once begged for help. He remembered how quiet the house had become after a while. Too quiet. How the porch light had stayed off. How Ellen had avoided eye contact in the weeks that followed. He rose from the table slowly, walked to the hallway, and opened the closet. From the top shelf, he pulled down a battered box taped at the corners. Inside were notebooks, dates, recordings. He had written it all down. At the time, it hadn't made sense to tell anyone. Who would have listened? But maybe now someone would. Outside, the wind picked up. The town of Ashford remained quiet, but beneath that quiet was something growing. A sense that the story they thought they knew was unraveling, thread by thread, and what lay beneath it might not be what they wanted to see. Harold Stern had not spoken to anyone in 3 days. It was not a deliberate act of protest or avoidance. It simply hadn't occurred to him that anyone would want to talk. After all, whoever listened to old men unless they were telling war stories or explaining how things used to cost a nickel? But this silence was different. It sat in the house like a guest he couldn't get rid of, pressing against the windows, settling into the floorboards. He hadn't turned on the television, hadn't answered his daughter's calls, hadn't even put on the radio. Instead, he sat at his small, uneven kitchen table, staring at the battered cardboard box he had pulled from the closet 2 nights ago. The box smelled faintly of dust and cedar. Its contents were neatly stacked, notebooks all identical in size and brand, spiral-bound with thick blue covers. They were the kind you bought in packs of 3 at the hardware store, nothing fancy. Each bore a date on the front in Harold's careful handwriting, beginning in 2017 and ending just a few months before Ellen Reeves's death. Beneath them was a smaller folder with a handful of photos and printouts. One of them, clipped to a yellow sticky note, showed Ellen and her mother on the front porch. The mother's face was partially turned, but even in profile, her expression seemed stiff, her smile strained. Ellen, by contrast, looked directly at the camera, her features composed, eyes unreadable. Harold had kept records, not out of malice, but out of instinct. It had started the way habits often do, with a single moment that felt off. He remembered the night clearly, a winter evening in February, cold enough that his pipes had nearly frozen. He had stepped outside to salt the walkway and heard what he thought was an argument. A woman shouting. Not the kind of raised voice that comes with a spat over dinner, but something sharper, more desperate. When he looked over, he saw Ellen's mother standing on the back porch in only a thin nightgown and slippers. She was holding a blanket around her shoulders, her body trembling. Harold had called out, asked if she needed help. She hadn't answered. Instead, Ellen had come to the door, waved cheerfully, and said her mother had gotten confused again. Alzheimer's, she explained. Sometimes she wanders. It had seemed plausible, and yet something in her tone, a lightness too rehearsed, stuck with him. That night, he began to write things down. Over time, the entries grew more detailed. He documented the times he heard banging noises, sharp crashes in the middle of the night. Screaming, sometimes muffled, sometimes clear. Once, he had watched through his blinds as Ellen wheeled a large, covered object into the backyard and dumped what appeared to be bedding into a trash bag. There had been no garbage pickup that day. He noted the days when the porch light stayed off for weeks, the mail that accumulated on the doorstep, the sound of what he could only describe as sobbing from somewhere deep within the house. He had debated, more than once, whether to tell someone. He called the police once, an anonymous tip. They had come, spoken briefly with Ellen on the front steps, and left. Nothing came of it. After that, he stopped calling. He told himself it wasn't his business, that he had no proof, that maybe she really was just taking care of a sick parent, and who was he to interfere? But when the snakes appeared, first at the original burial, then again at the second site, Harold knew. He didn't believe in signs or omens. He didn't think the earth gave a damn about what people did behind closed doors. But something was wrong. Something had been wrong for years. And now, finally, people were beginning to ask the right questions. He picked up the phone and dialed the number he'd saved from the newspaper, Mia Carter's cell. Her voicemail picked up after 3 rings. Harold left a brief message giving his name and address, then hung up. He didn't know if she'd come, but if she did, he'd tell her everything. Mia arrived the next morning. She was younger than Harold expected, mid-20s maybe. She wore jeans and a black t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her eyes were tired but alert, scanning the yard as she approached the porch. Harold met her at the door, holding it open with one hand. "Mr. Stern?" she asked. He nodded. "You're the reporter." "Yes." He led her into the living room, a small, tidy space with worn furniture and framed photos on the walls. Family portraits, fishing trips, a wedding long past. He gestured for her to sit, then brought the box from the kitchen and set it on the coffee table between them. "I kept notes," he said, "about the woman next door, Ellen Reeves." Mia opened the box slowly, flipping through the notebooks. Her expression didn't change, but Harold could see the flicker of focus in her eyes. She was reading quickly, lips moving silently as she scanned the entries. "You saw all this?" she asked after a moment. "I heard most of it," he replied. "Saw some. Enough to know something wasn't right." She nodded, then turned to the folder. When she reached the photo of Ellen and her mother, she paused. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the image. "I've been asking around," she said. "No one's seen the mother in months. Some thought she moved away. Others thought she died already. But there's no record, no obituary, no burial." Harold leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. I think she died in that house, and I don't think anyone knew but Ellen. Mia didn't answer right away. She flipped to another notebook, reading an entry dated June 3rd. It described a night when the house had been silent for hours, followed by a single loud bang around 2 a.m. After that, no more crying, no more footsteps. The porch light never came on again. I want to go inside the house, she said quietly. Harold nodded. You'll need a warrant, or permission from whoever owns it now. I'll find a way. That afternoon, Mia drove to the town records office. The property deed still listed Ellen Reeves as the owner. No next of kin had stepped forward. The house had not yet entered probate, which meant it remained sealed, pending a formal claim. But the mayor's office, eager to cooperate in the wake of the cemetery incidents, granted her temporary access. Journalistic investigation, they called it. A formality. The house was quiet when she arrived. The air around it felt still, heavy with the kind of silence that made her ears ring. The front porch was clean, but the windows were closed tight, blinds drawn. She tried the key left for her by the city clerk. The door creaked open. Inside, the house smelled of dust and antiseptic. The living room was immaculate. Books aligned on shelves, couch cushions fluffed, not a speck of dirt in sight. It was the kind of cleanliness that felt curated, not lived in. Mia moved through the rooms carefully, noting the absence of personal items. No photos of the mother, no mobility aids, no medication bottles, nothing to suggest an elderly, ill woman had lived there at all. She reached the kitchen. On the fridge, a dry erase board bore a single line. Don't forget, hospice appointment Friday. The date was smudged, unreadable. The trash bin was empty, the drawers too clean. Then she found the door to the basement. It was locked, but the key fit. The stairs creaked beneath her weight as she descended into the darkness. The smell hit her first, musty, sour, the scent of decay masked by bleach. Her flashlight beam swept across the room, a medical bed in one corner, sheets still on it, a bedpan, a tray of uneaten food, crusted and dry, a pair of slippers on the floor. The walls bore scratch marks, faint but unmistakable. And in the corner, a small folded wheelchair. Mia's breath caught. She stood frozen, the light trembling in her hands. This wasn't just neglect. This was abandonment, isolation, containment. She took photos, dozens, every corner, every detail. When she emerged, the light outside felt too bright. She locked the door behind her, hands shaking. That night, she sat in her apartment, staring at the screen. The article would take hours. Days, maybe. But the headline had already formed in her mind. The town's beloved heroine was not who they thought, and the graveyard hadn't rejected her by accident. It had remembered. Mia Carter did not sleep that night. Sleep required stillness, and her mind was anything but still. The images from the basement rotated through her thoughts with relentless precision, flashing in sharp, uncomfortable focus each time she closed her eyes. The medical bed with its tangled sheets, the dried food, untouched, the faint, almost imperceptible claw marks on the wall, and above all, the silence. The terrible, suffocating silence of a space that had held a person, isolated and unseen, until it held them no longer. She sat at her desk, wrapped in an old hoodie, sipping cold coffee and reading back through the notes she had taken. The facts were damning. Ellen Reeves, the woman Ashford had idolized, had kept her mother confined in a locked basement, deprived of sunlight, social contact, and possibly basic care. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet Mia hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of gravity. She understood what it would mean to publish this. It would unravel a narrative that the entire town had accepted as truth. It would transform a saint into a monster. And some people, she knew, would never forgive her for it. By morning, her decision was made. She would need to corroborate everything. She wouldn't rely on photographs and Harold's journals alone. She needed additional voices, proof that what she had found wasn't an isolated perception but part of a larger, ignored pattern. Her first call was to the Ashford Home Hospice Center. She had already scoured their website and found a general contact number. A woman answered, pleasant but clearly distracted. "I'm trying to locate any service records for a former resident," Mia said carefully. "A woman named Diane Reeves. She lived on Sycamore Street. Her daughter, Ellen, was her caregiver." There was a pause. Paper rustled. "One moment, please." The line went silent. When the voice returned, it had changed. Less polite, more cautious. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't release any patient information without legal authorization." "I understand. But I'm not asking for medical records," Mia replied. "I just need to know if you ever attempted to admit her, or if any services were rendered at that address." Again, the pause. Then, quietly, "We visited once, about a year ago. A caseworker conducted an in-home assessment. After that, the daughter declined all services." "Was a reason given?" "Not really. She just said she could handle it herself. We followed up twice. No answer." Mia scribbled notes furiously. "Do you recall the caseworker's name?" "I think it was Rachel Edmonds. She doesn't work here anymore." An hour later, Mia found Rachel Edmonds on LinkedIn, a former hospice case manager now working in a hospital an hour north. She messaged her, then followed up with a phone call. Rachel answered on the third ring. "I remember the house," Rachel said immediately, before Mia even finished introducing herself. "I've thought about it a lot." Mia straightened in her chair. "What do you remember?" "I remember the mother looked fragile, underweight, but her eyes were clear. She wasn't confused, not even a little. Ellen wouldn't let me talk to her alone. Kept standing behind her, touching her shoulder, smiling too much." "Did you report it?" "I flagged it. But there was nothing concrete, no bruises, no injuries. And the mother didn't say anything. She wouldn't speak much at all, just kept looking down." "Why didn't you go back?" "I tried, but the daughter didn't answer the door or return calls. The system's overloaded. One red flag with no follow-up. Things fall through the cracks." Mia thanked her and hung up, her pulse racing. It was happening. The story was beginning to take shape. What she'd seen in that basement wasn't a singular moment. It was part of a long, quiet pattern of neglect. A system that had failed a vulnerable woman, a town that had turned away, and a daughter who had hidden cruelty behind service and smiles. Next, she called the garbage service. With enough polite persistence and vague references to a potential timeline discrepancy, she convinced a clerk to pull disposal records from Ellen's address. They confirmed irregular pickup patterns, long periods with no bins placed at the curb. Then, 2 months before Ellen's death, a spike. 8 bags in a single week, followed by nothing. No more trash, no more signs of life. The final call she made was to the county coroner's office. She inquired about any death certificate filed for Diane Reeves. There was none. Mia sat back in her chair, staring at the whiteboard she had covered in names, dates, and clipped photos. It was a grim tapestry. At its center was Ellen's face, still smiling, still composed, still framed by the glowing praise of articles and awards. And all around her, the truth, silence, avoidance, disappearance. She opened a new document on her computer. The House of Silence, The Hidden Life of Ellen Reeves. The story began with facts, a list of known events. Ellen's death, the failed burials, the snakes. But then it shifted into the interviews, the observations, the timeline of a mother vanishing from public view, the hospice rejection, the sealed basement, the items left untouched for months. She wove in Harold's accounts carefully, respectfully, ensuring they supported the larger narrative rather than dominating it. She quoted Rachel Edmonds. She referenced public records. She included photographs, tastefully chosen, but undeniable in their implications. By nightfall, the article was complete. Mia read it 3 times, then sent it to her editor with a single line in the body of the email, "It's time." The story ran the next morning. Ashford woke to a headline that split the town down its center. "Behind the casket, what Ellen Reeves didn't want you to know." The response was immediate: shock, outrage, denial. Some praised Mia for her courage, her honesty, her commitment to truth. Others accused her of character assassination, of slandering a dead woman who could no longer defend herself. Online forums buzzed with debate. Parents who had loved Ellen's work at the school felt betrayed. Former colleagues posted long, conflicted messages. The school district issued a cautious statement, affirming their commitment to student safety while declining to comment on ongoing personal investigations. The mayor called for calm. The city council scheduled an emergency meeting. The cemetery remained closed. But amid the noise, something deeper shifted. A silence less benign than the one that had hung over Ashford in the days following Ellen's death. This was the silence of shame, of recognition, of complicity. People who had lived near Ellen for years began to remember things. The closed blinds, the ignored invitations, the absence of her mother. They began to ask why they had never questioned it, why they had accepted her goodness at face value. Harold Stern sat on his porch, listening to the wind. He hadn't spoken to many people since the article came out, but he felt something different now. Not vindication, just relief. That someone had finally seen what he had seen. That the truth, once buried, had found its way back to the surface. And, in the funeral home, the director moved Ellen's casket into a side room. No one had called to reschedule the burial. No family, no church, no one at all. The casket waited, and the earth, for now, remained closed. By the time the sun crested over Ashford on the morning following the article's release, the town had already begun to fracture in ways both subtle and violent. On the surface, the day looked like any other. Mail trucks made their rounds, children waited for buses, the grocery store opened at 8. But beneath that thin patina of routine, a slow, electric unrest pulsed through streets that had always considered themselves safe from such things. Ellen Reeves's name, once a symbol of quiet virtue and civic pride, had become something else entirely, unresolved, dangerous, and now inescapable. The article had not simply exposed a disturbing truth, it had broken the town's sense of collective certainty. People had not just admired Ellen, they had relied on her, for guidance, for inspiration, for the idea that someone, at least, had been doing things right. And now, faced with the possibility that she had harbored abuse behind locked doors, they were unsure not just of her, but of themselves. How had they not seen it? What else had they missed? At the center of the storm stood Mia Carter. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since 6 in the morning. Some calls were from major news outlets asking for quotes or permission to reprint. Others were from angry residents accusing her of ruining a legacy. A few were deathly quiet, people breathing on the line, then hanging up. Her email inbox swelled with subject lines that alternated between "thank you" and "you'll pay for this." She ignored most of them. There was too much work left to do. She had scheduled a follow-up interview with Ellen's only surviving relative, her older brother, Andrew Reeves, who had flown in from Oregon 2 days after the story broke. A quiet man in his early 40s with thinning hair and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile, Andrew had not returned to Ashford in more than a decade. His relationship with Ellen, it turned out, had been strained, at best. Mia met him in a rented conference room at the local library. He arrived 15 minutes early, dressed plainly, with a single folder tucked under his arm. They shook hands, and Mia offered him coffee, which he declined. When they sat, he placed the folder on the table without opening it. "I don't know what you already have," he said, "but I can fill in some of the blanks." She let him speak without interruption. She wasn't always like this. When we were kids, Ellen was intense, focused, always had to be the best at everything. Grades, sports, school plays. If she couldn't win, she'd pretend it didn't matter, but it always mattered, especially when it came to our mother. He shifted in his seat. Our dad left early. I was 14. Ellen was 11. After that, Mom sort of collapsed into herself. She wasn't abusive, not really, just tired, sad, depressed maybe. I left home when I turned 18. Ellen stayed. She took care of Mom, but it changed her. She started resenting her. You could see it. Did you keep in touch? Not really. I'd call on holidays, visit once every few years, but eventually she stopped answering. She sent a Christmas card in 2018. That was the last time I heard from her. Mia nodded. "Do you know when your mother died?" Andrew shook his head. "I assumed it had happened. Ellen wouldn't have told me. I didn't think to check. And when I saw the funeral announcement, I didn't even plan to come. I only came when I read your article." He opened the folder. Inside were old letters, photos, documents, pieces of a life now frozen in hindsight. One photograph showed a young Ellen and her mother in the front yard. The mother was holding a book. Ellen, even as a teenager, looked oddly composed, as if she already understood the image would last longer than the moment. Andrew slid the photo across the table. She was always more interested in what people thought of her than who she actually was. She needed the world to believe she was kind, but kindness isn't something you perform. Mia thanked him and asked for permission to use the interview. He agreed with a shrug. "I don't care about protecting her memory," he said. "I care about the truth. Maybe now someone will remember my mother too." Later that day, Mia walked to the school where Ellen had taught. It was quiet. Summer break had begun, and only a skeleton staff remained. The principal, a square-shouldered woman named Darlene Joyce, met her at the front doors. Her face was drawn, her voice brittle. "I won't lie to you," she said. "This has shaken us. The staff, the parents, the entire district." They sat in the front office, the smell of pencil shavings and floor wax lingering in the air. Ellen was seen as a leader here. She trained new teachers. She wrote curriculum guides. We invited her to speak at conferences. Mia opened her notebook. "Did you ever notice anything strange about her behavior? Anything that didn't sit right?" Darlene hesitated. "I don't know what to tell you. She was controlled, always polite, always professional. But if I'm honest, sometimes too polished. Nothing slipped through. You'd ask how her weekend was, and she'd smile and change the subject." Did she ever speak about her mother? Only once. A brief mention, maybe a year ago. She said her mother was struggling with health issues, but that it was under control. I remember the phrase because it sounded rehearsed. Mia jotted it down. Do you regret not asking more? Darlene folded her hands. Of course. But the truth is, we don't always know what to ask. And sometimes people like Ellen are very good at keeping the surface clean. Outside the school, the memorial that had once stood near the flagpole, photos, flowers, handwritten cards had been removed. A small plaque remained, but someone had scratched through her name. Beneath it, in red marker, someone had scrawled, "She knew what she did." That night, the school board held an emergency meeting. Mia attended, seated in the back row as officials debated what to do about the district's public association with Ellen. Some wanted to remove all references to her name, erase her from the official record. Others argued for a more measured response, citing her years of service and the lack of legal proceedings. The meeting ended without resolution. The next day, Ellen's casket was quietly removed from the funeral home. No family had come to claim it. No pastor had agreed to officiate. No friends had offered a eulogy. The town had gone quiet around her, like a body rejecting a foreign organ. The funeral director called the mayor's office for instructions. After a brief consultation, they arranged for a municipal burial in a corner of the cemetery that had not yet been disturbed by snake or storm. Miguel Sanchez was asked to assist again. When he arrived at the site, a quiet patch near the rear fence, he found Roy already waiting. They dug the grave in silence. No snakes emerged this time. No tremors rippled through the ground. The soil yielded easily, as if its anger had passed. The casket was lowered without ceremony. No music played. No prayers were said. A light rain began to fall, soaking into the dirt as they shoveled it back over the lid. Miguel paused halfway through and looked at the wooden box beneath his feet. He thought of the children who had cried at her service, the parents who had blessed her name, the students who had carried her lessons like talismans. Then he thought of the basement. The shovel struck the earth again. Across town, Harold Stern read the notice in the newspaper. Private burial completed. No time listed, no location, just a line of text, unceremonious and final. He folded the paper and looked out the window. Something inside him felt still, not peaceful, not satisfied, but still. And far away, in the now empty house on Sycamore Street, the air hung heavy. Dust collected on the windowsills. The basement door remained locked, but the silence no longer felt complete. It felt like breath held in, waiting, watching, remembering. The days following Ellen Reeves's final burial passed not with relief, but with something closer to suspended breath. The town of Ashford, so eager once to rally around its icons, now drifted in a kind of collective hesitation, as if unsure how to reclaim its narrative. It was not just grief that had unsettled them, nor even the shock of betrayal, but the disorienting realization that they had participated, passively perhaps, but with sincerity, in the creation of a fiction. The grave itself, situated in a remote corner of the cemetery where no family stones bordered, was marked by a temporary plaque no bigger than a shoebox. The name was spelled correctly, the dates accurate, but no inscription accompanied it. No beloved teacher or devoted daughter. Just the bare record of time and identity. The brass glinted weakly in the morning sun, almost embarrassed by its own presence. Miguel Sanchez had gone back once, 2 days after the burial, just to look. He told himself it was a matter of duty, to make sure the site had settled correctly, but the truth was more complicated. He stood for a long time beside the small mound of earth, hands in his pockets, waiting for something. A sign, perhaps, or the return of that uneasy stirring in the ground that had once warned them away. But the soil remained still. No snakes appeared. No sudden wind swept through the trees. The cemetery was quiet, solemn in the way all places of the dead are. He left without speaking to anyone. Elsewhere in town, the rhythms of daily life tried to reassert themselves. The grocery store restocked its shelves. The library reopened with a new display in place of the memorial table that had once featured Ellen's photo. At the school, preparations for the upcoming academic year began without mention of her name. In staff meetings and hallway conversations, she was referred to only obliquely, if at all. Her desk in the second-grade classroom was cleared by a janitor in silence. The materials were boxed and labeled, but never sent to storage. They sat in a corner of the main office, as if awaiting further instruction that would never come. Mia Carter spent those days writing. Not news articles, but notes, personal reflections, observations, details that hadn't made it into print. She filled 2 notebooks and began a third, driven not by any assignment, but by a compulsion to understand something deeper than facts. She had told the truth, and the town had heard it, but what lingered now was a different kind of question, one that no interview could answer. How does a community reconcile the person it believed in with the person that was? And more than that, how does it live with the quiet knowledge that the two had never been the same? One afternoon, she returned to the house on Sycamore Street. It had not been sold. No one had touched it. The windows remained shuttered, the porch bare except for a few dead leaves blown in by the wind. The key still worked. She had never turned it in. When she stepped inside, the air was thick with the musty scent of vacancy. Dust had begun to settle along the banisters, the baseboards, the seams of the furniture. She walked slowly through each room, letting the silence soak into her bones. In the living room, the clock above the mantel had stopped ticking. A single coffee cup still sat on the end table beside an unopened library book. The kitchen was spotless, unnaturally so. The refrigerator was empty. On the counter, a calendar lay open to the month of February. A doctor's appointment circled in red, the last note Ellen had written in her own home. She made her way down the hall and stopped before the basement door. It had been locked before. Now it wasn't. She pushed it open and descended the stairs, one hand trailing the rough wood of the railing. The air grew cooler as she went, tinged with the faint metallic scent of age. The basement was unchanged. Bed, chair, tray, all in place. The bedding had not been removed. The walls still bore the faint scars of hands reaching out to nowhere. But something had shifted. She stood in the center of the room and closed her eyes. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the space, not just its emptiness, but its memory. This room had held a woman, a mother, someone who had lived and wept and disappeared, all within the confines of a silence no one had dared disturb. Mia thought of Diane Reeves not as a victim in a newspaper story, but as a person. Someone whose presence had been so thoroughly erased that it had taken a town's grief to remember her at all. She opened her eyes and looked toward the far wall. There, half concealed behind a box of linens, she saw it, a framed photograph. The glass was cracked, the frame chipped, but the image inside was intact. It showed Diane in her younger years, seated on a bench beneath a flowering tree, sunlight streaking her hair. Her eyes were bright, her smile unguarded. There was no sign of illness, no hint of sadness, just a woman in a moment of peace. Mia took the photo and carried it upstairs. Later, she visited Harold Stern. He answered the door with a nod and led her to the porch without needing to ask why she'd come. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the creak of the rocking chairs, the chirp of birds in the distant trees. "I went back to the house," she said eventually. Harold didn't respond. "I found a photo of Diane, before all of it, before it went wrong." Still, he said nothing. "I think people need to see it," she added, "to remember her as someone other than the woman Ellen buried before her death." At last, Harold turned his head. His eyes were dry but distant, looking somewhere beyond the lawn. "They won't want to," he said. "They'll want to forget. That's what people do with shame. Bury it deep." Mia nodded. "Then I'll remind them." That weekend, the Ashford Historical Society hosted its annual open house. Originally intended as a lighthearted event, antiques, homemade pies, exhibits of local lore, it had taken on a more somber tone in light of recent events. Attendance was low. Spirits were quieter. In the back corner of the main hall, a small table had been reserved for independent contributions. Mia placed the photograph there. She didn't label it. She didn't include an explanation. She let the image speak for itself. Over the course of the day, several people stopped to look. A few recognized Diane's face. Most did not, but the picture remained, a quiet artifact of a story they had almost allowed to vanish. As evening fell, the building emptied. A janitor made his rounds, collecting trash, straightening chairs. When he reached Mia's table, he paused. He studied the photo for a long time. Then, instead of discarding it, he placed it in a clean frame and moved it to a shelf near the front door, beneath a plaque that read, "Voices of Ashford." Outside, the air turned cooler. The streets of the town lay quiet beneath the first hints of autumn wind. And on the outskirts, in the quiet cemetery where the grass grew a little taller and the names on the stones began to fade, a small plain marker stood alone. No one visited, but the earth at last was still. If this story made you think, subscribe for more. Watch the next video. You won't believe what happens there. And don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to see it.